Hey guys, Two with Team Ronin, and welcome to Teachings of a Ronin. Today, let's talk about mixed martial arts and how I've taken different martial arts and put it into combat. As a modern day Ronin, I travel around the United States to help train military, law enforcement, and law-abiding citizens. And during this process, a lot of my students ask me, hey Two, what martial arts do you draw from? So let's talk about that.
Turn it up, let it start. From block to block, we snatching hearts and jacking marks. And the punk police can't fade me a minute. We can have peace someday, G. But right now I got my mind set up. Looking down the barrel of my gun, get up. Cause it's time to make the payback facts. And my brothers on the block better stay strapped. Black, and accept no substitutes. I bring truth to the youth. Tell the roof of the whole school. Oh no, I won't turn the other cheek.
Before we get into the martial art aspect of it, you need to understand the mindset behind my formless style. First, let's talk about martial arts and what that means. Martial means military, and arts is a practice of. Back in war stating periods around the world, you had martial arts, and it was used for defense. It was used for offensive tactics in time of conflict and war. After war stating periods, you had practitioners that wanted to practice in these lethal forms, but obviously a lot of these forms had to get diluted, and that's what you see kind of played out today in very controlled environments, as in dojos and MMA matches. In combat, there's no rules. There's no referees going to tell you to stop. There's no point system, and there's no tapping out. Combat is to the death. Forms in combat were extremely lethal, and they were often used with employment of weapons on the battlefield. A lot of these forms throughout the years, and I'm talking about hundreds of years, it gets diluted. Along with this comes a different mindset. You can't take a traditional martial art mindset that you pick up in the dojo and assume that that's going to work in real life. In real life, there's employment of weapons, there's situations that you have to evaluate. A lot of things I see nowadays is a lot of students will go to dojos and they'll go to these MMA schools and they'll practice on these forms of martial arts. And a lot of these forms do work in that type of controlled environment. And when I say that is, there's no weapons in that controlled environment. In the countries that I've been through, it's extremely violent. Some of these areas are ran by rebels and militia groups that do not like Westerners. So I have taken this kind of mindset and I had to look at martial arts in a different way. I started my martial arts training when I was 8 years old. It was very traditional, base martial arts training, which normal kids usually received in dojos. I trained a lot with my stepfather, who was an American Special Forces Green Beret, so he kind of gave me that snapshot of unconventional warfare and to kind of think outside the box. When I was 18 years old, I joined the Army and I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. I spent a very short time there before I tried out for the long-range reconnaissance units. Long-range reconnaissance, we worked in very small numbers, and we were the eyes and ears for the ground force commander. In the LRS units, we did train in hand-to-hand combat. A lot of this forms of hand-to-hand combat came out of Ranger tactics learned in World War II and the Vietnam War. The hand-to-hand combat was extremely violent. It was to put your fingers through somebody's eyes. It was to bust out their eardrums. We learned pressure points. We learned where to hit the enemy to misorient their balance. Usually this ended with some form of weaponry that we employ on our threat. Then I tried out for the Special Forces Assessment Selection and eventually went through the Special Forces Qualification course. Around that time, I started seeing UFC get more popular. It was really unique back then because you could truly see the different forms and styles. The two forms that really were successful during that time was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai. Eventually I made it to the Special Forces. At 21, I was assigned to the Special Forces A team out in Okinawa, Japan. During that time, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was really heavy on the A teams. We would have dedicated combatives days where we go and train in the art of ground fighting. From 98 to 2001, we deployed throughout Southeast Asia, where I was able to cross-train with different commando units, and I was able to see different ancient forms within their culture of martial arts. Some of the forms I picked up was an ancient form of Sulat. It was pretty interesting because we were training jungle raids, and we would train all day in these jungle raids, and at night we'll go back to, you know, the villages. And during that time, I would cross-train with the local commandos in their ancient forms of martial arts. In Indonesia, I picked up the art of Sulat. Sulat is a very deadly form if used right. It's a lot of leg sweeps. It's a lot of parrying an attack. It's being able to reflect energy, be able to block and strike at the same time. A lot of these forms that I noticed throughout Southeast Asia, like Wing Chun, Sulat, Kali, a lot of the forms are very similar in their attack patterns. 9/11 happened, and the Special Forces groups were immediately deployed into the global war. Our area operation with 1st Special Forces Group was Southeast Asia at that time. First deployment in a global war was deployed down into the southern regions of the Philippines and combat the Busayaf terrorist group. It was during this time that I picked up the ancient art of Kali from the Filipinos commandos. Kali is an ancient form of Filipino martial arts, and it utilizes a lot of empty hands into sticks and impact weapons and blades. During my multiple deployments into the Philippines, I would train into the art of Kali. The Iraq War happened, and I deployed into Iraq several times. And what was really unique about this time was we were able to get a lot of intelligence in from different special operations units within the SOCOM community. And what was really interesting was that, you know, during that time, the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force and even the Army, we would all usually practice in the same form of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that's just because of the success that came out of UFC. But what I found was really interesting was that, you know, there was case reports of guys getting stabbed by their own blades. Weapons were drawn from their equipment. If you look at the primary form that the SOCOM community was practicing on back then, was very heavy Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the basis of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was about position before submission. And it drops us down to a certain level of the fight. And when I say that is, you know, if you're standing at a long distance range, that's a different level. And if you're, you know, at close quarters range where you're able to hit the opponent or kick the opponent, and that's a different range. If you're able to grab and grapple standing, that's a different range. Takedown into ground fighting, those are all different levels of a fight. And what I found was we were training at the ground level of the fight. If you think about close quarters combat, a gunfight, you don't want to be on the ground. You want to be at that angle where you have situational awareness of what's going on. A gunfight can change within matters of a millisecond. So what we found out during that time was guys would drop down to that level of the fight and they'll get their opponent into a certain position of control. When we get our enemies into these positions of dominance, was that they were able to still employ our weapons on our kit and use it against us. Guys have been stabbed in the neck, in the face. Guys have been, you know, weapons have been drawn from their hip line just because of that level of the fight. I mean, you're going to the ground. The positioning of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as in side mount, guarded positions, mounted positions, it put us in a very vulnerable state just because of the equipment that we're wearing on us. Extremely hard to move with all this gear on. A very confined space as a small room with furniture. It's hard to move on the ground like on a normal mat that you find on a Jiu-Jitsu dojo. I'm sure some of you out there are practitioners of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I personally think that's a great form of martial art, but not in combat. Personally, I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is one of the better forms of martial arts that you can practice out there for ground fighting at that level to fight. Once you start implementing weapons and strategy and tactics, that we use in a close quarters combat, that form may not work for you because it puts you in a vulnerable state. So my approach to martial art was just that. It was drawing from different forms and styles that I personally seen and practiced throughout the world and putting together my own formless style, very much like what Bruce Lee said during his teachings was, he believed in a formless style. He didn't believe in one form was it. The JKD was truly MMA in his eyes back then. It wasn't utilized just for, aspects of Jeet Kune Do. It was actually a mixture of different forms. He talked about implementing boxing and wrestling and judo and Wing Chun, Chinese boxing, and all these forms into his formless style. So people ask me, hey, what's a good martial art in combat? You can't think about taking one martial art and saying, hey, that's great for combat. Truly, martial arts should be a mixture of different forms and styles, right? In combat, it's about drawing the different martial arts that's going to enhance your gunfighting skills. It's going to enhance your foot movements. It's going to enhance your ability for situational awareness. It's going to allow you to stay in the dominant position, which is on your feet, not on the ground. For me, it was about taking different forms of martial art and putting into tactics and strategy and weaponry and stay at that dominant position, which was on my feet. If I was taken on the ground, then obviously I trained in the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but that's not where I want to go. I want to stay on my feet. I want to have situational awareness of the threats in the area. There was a certain stage in my career that was extremely sensitive where I had to deploy around the world to conduct reconnaissance and surveillance. I felt like these type of missions were extremely dangerous just because I didn't have the war assets. I didn't have the eyes in the sky. I could not have all the intelligence or the weapons that I had in times of war. Sometimes my primary weapon was just a pistol. So I had to rely a lot on my training. Training was extremely classified. I was taught a lot of tradecraft and the streetcraft aspects. So I learned a lot on how to funnel the threat into a certain area. So I took that strategy and I put it into my martial arts while conducting these missions. Put us in countries where there's very few Americans in that country. A lot of times our reinforcements were usually deployed 8 hours away in some other country. So we had to be trained at a certain level in hand-to-hand combat. A street fight is about weapons. It's about utilizing different forms of weapons, picking up a rock or anything around you and use that as a weapon. So along with that comes a different mindset. I was able to understand that pretty early on. To pull different forms of martial arts that enhance my mobility to allow me to stay at that level of the fight where I was able to have situational awareness of the environment and the terrain. Due to my tradecraft and streetcraft training, I was able to read terrain and funnel the threat into a confined space. So a lot of my martial arts during that time was about creating that distance, creating that time to employ weapons, to be able to strategize, situational awareness, to be able to evade if I need to. So it's not about going to the ground and tapping the guy out. A lot of these environments were very hostile. That means if I got in a fight with some threat in the area, then there could be multiple threats in the area. The mindset behind my martial art was very heavy weapons based. That means that I'll either fabricate a weapon, I can use a pin, a rock, I can use blades, guns, whatever I can find in a open market or a grocery store. You can find a knife at any grocery store. So a lot of these countries, I had to arm myself with what I seen in, grocery stores or at local markets. MMA fighter who studies his environment, which is the cage or the ring, and he also studies opponent. In the Special Forces, we did the same, where we had to study our environment, the terrain, the situation, the threats in the area, and the weapons. And we're able to understand this deeply in order to employ the necessary martial arts to enhance the skills that we will need in order to survive and excel in these type of environments. By understanding the street fighting side of the house, then you will understand that it's not about tapping out, it's not about choking the guy out, there's no referee. You're going to have to read the situation, you have to read the threats in the area, and if the situation arises that you need to evade, then you need to pick the martial arts that's going to allow you that mobility that you're going to need. To understand the outcome from employing martial arts within certain countries in the area, you need to understand the terrain and how that's going to affect you. Hope you enjoyed this light discussion on MMA and how I was able to take the mixed martial art mindset and put it into combat. Continue to follow us as Team Ronin travels around the United States to train our military, law enforcement, and law-abiding citizens. I hope to meet you guys one day as we travel around and teach into the next teachings of Ronin. Life in every breath.